We've been in chapter 8, and we've been seeing things that Jesus has done. He is powerfully demonstrating just how much authority that he has. As Jesus of Nazareth, he is also God incarnate. He has all authority. We've seen how he has miraculously restored people from incurable things like leprosy and like paralysis and a fever. And in verse 16, we see an astounding summary of what he did. It says that he cast out demons with a word, and he healed all who were sick. Nothing was too difficult for Jesus to handle. There was no one who left him that wasn't healed, that wasn't helped. And it's because Jesus has authority over the physical and the spiritual realms. Verse 17 pointed out, Matthew writes, that this was to identify him as the Messiah, that he is the one, God's Savior, God's King, who was sent into the world to rule and to bring righteousness and to bring healing to all the nations. So as people begin to see this and people begin to hear this, they start flocking to Jesus and say, "We want to follow you." But not everybody was coming with the same motivations. And we find in verse 18 that Jesus desires disciples, not just collecting crowds. There Matthew writes this: "Now when Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee where he was currently at." This was going to be his strategy, to determine whether people were just curious about him or if they were actually committed to him. And the way that he's going to test them comes down to one thing, and that is obedience. He doesn't just say, "Hey, I'm thinking about going across the sea. I want to go to the other side and do some ministry there. Do you want to come with me?" No, look at what Matthew writes. His choice of words is this: Jesus gave orders to go to the other side. In other words, Jesus is saying, anyone who is choosing to follow me, we're leaving. And it's time to go. Let's go to the other side. So this is the test. Who is going to obey Jesus? There's a big difference between being a fan of Jesus and being a follower of Jesus. We know that fans love the show. They love the miracles. They love the teaching. That they will cheer for Jesus as he does these things. They will stand near him, cheer him on, and say, "I'm on his team." But Jesus isn't looking for a fan base. He's not looking just to have a crowd. He's looking for followers. He is a king. He demands obedience, and he's on a mission. Jesus wants followers, those who aren't merely, excited or enthusiastic when they win and full of excuses when they lose, but that are obedient, that are committed to Jesus no matter what happens all the way until the end. And today we're going to meet two individuals in this passage. Two of them who come from the crowd. They come to Jesus and they say, "I want to follow you." They want to, and Jesus welcomes that. He doesn't turn anybody away, but he tells them, he tests them in their commitment to follow. When he tests their commitment, we find one of these people who comes to him that he is all excitement, all enthusiasm. The other one who comes to Jesus is all excuses, why he can't follow now, but he wants to. And I think that in both of these cases, we find the ends of the spectrum of fans who come to Jesus. Either they're full of excuses and they will, but not yet, or the other one where they're ready to go, but they haven't counted the cost yet. This is the spectrum, and I think we'll find ourselves where we tend to lean one way or another, and we'll have to test our own selves, our own hearts, our own commitment to see if we are just fans or if we are actually followers of Jesus. And to find out, it's simple. When Jesus gives this command, followers obey. Fans won't follow, but followers will obey. Let's read chapter 8, verses 19 to 22. And a scribe came up and said to him, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Another of the disciples said to him, "Lord, let me first go and bury my father." And Jesus said to him, "Follow me. Leave the dead to bury their own dead." So the first person that we meet is here in verse 19. He was a scribe. And a scribe was someone who studied the law of God. They wrote copies of the scriptures. They studied the law of God. And they were so familiar with the first 5 books of the Bible that they called the law, that they could quote it from memory. Anywhere, just begin to go and quote. They were so familiar with it. Even Leviticus, which has all these fine print, small, odd laws, they loved this stuff. They understood, they knew the words and the nuances and the connections within the scriptures, that they were then deemed to be the teachers of Israel. The scribes knew the most. They had amassed so much understanding of what God was trying to communicate. They studied it, they analyzed it, they memorized it. And so they were considered the teachers in Israel. And so people would come to them. They would ask the questions that they couldn't understand from the scriptures. They would say, "Well, I don't know what to do in my life. I don't know how to obey God or please him with this," because the Bible doesn't directly address that. And so with all of their knowledge and all of their perceived wisdom, they would say, "Here, this is what God is saying. This is how you should obey him." And with such an honorable and significant position among the people, they presumed proudly that they knew the most. And they would argue with people and show them where they were wrong. And they loved to just debate the scriptures. What is God really saying? And because of this, this is why when Jesus shows up and he begins to teach the law in the Sermon on the Mount, and he's totally different, because at the end of that sermon, it says that the people recognized that he taught as one with authority more than the scribes. And it was the scribes who joined forces with all the other people who wanted to crucify Jesus. So it is a bit surprising that we see a scribe coming here to Jesus in verse 19. And in fact, what we find here is that he approaches Jesus with the same word, with the same sort of respect and even submission to Jesus as we did see in the leper and the centurion before him. The scribe, calls him teacher, which is interesting because they wouldn't throw around that name for nothing. You'd have to earn that title in Israel. Most of these people, most of the scribes would have seen themselves as the teacher, and they would have seen Jesus as a peasant preacher from an insignificant town of Nazareth. I mean, what good could come from there, they thought. And yet this scribe sees something different. Maybe while he was listening, maybe he was there on the Sermon on the Mount, and he was listening to how Jesus was teaching the law, and he began to think in his own heart that Jesus has more authority than me. Jesus has more authority than the scribes. And so what we find here is that he comes, he calls him teacher, and he says, "I want to follow you." And so we have this commitment, this desire to follow. The scribe had no doubt heard many different other scribes. He had grown up spending decades analyzing, memorizing the law. He would have known himself and tried to figure out what is it that God is really trying to communicate through the words of Scripture. But then Jesus begins to speak, and he doesn't appeal to other scribes and what they have said. He doesn't appeal to other famous rabbis or published scholars or anything like that. He says, "You've heard other people say this about the Scriptures, but I tell you this." And it made the scribe believe that he had heard the voice of God, the pure and deep form and meaning of the Word of God, that he's like, I need to follow this man. And so he comes and he calls him teacher. This was a big commitment that he's making. He says, "I will follow you wherever you go." In those days, rabbis were common. They were like pastors of the public. They would walk around. They would be seen as these godly examples of what it's like to obey God with your life and with your understanding. And they invited anyone who would follow a rabbi. The rabbi would then let them learn from them and their godly example. And this was common in those days. But this would require more than just visiting your rabbi. This would mean following the rabbi. That you would learn from their words. You would analyze their actions. You would learn, and this is how, by their example, to know how to obey and please God with your life. So choosing your rabbi was a very important decision. And that's what the scribe is intending to do here. He calls him teacher, or in other words, rabbi. And he says, I will follow you wherever you go. I will learn from you. I want to listen and watch and follow your example. Jesus had just commanded that his followers, if you're following, we're going to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. This bright-eyed scribe comes up to him and willingly says, I'm going to come. I'm going to follow you wherever you go. And so even though this sounds like faith, it sounds like he is a follower, there's something unique about this. Jesus sees something that he wants to test. When you look back at verse 10, where the centurion comes to Jesus, and Jesus turns to the crowd and says, I have never seen faith like this yet, not in Israel. He announces how wonderful the faith really is. But here he doesn't do that. It sounds like faith, but Jesus first tests this faith. Something was different, so he tests the level of commitment that this scribe really has. And in verse 20, Jesus starts talking about wildlife. He talks about foxes and birds, which were a common sight where the Jewish people lived, in those regions. They were the wild animals that people would see as they traveled from town to town. These animals would just roam and fly freely around wherever they pleased. And they weren't like the domestic animals that you would put in a stable and you would take care of and give food to like other animals. These were just foxes, and they ran around. But they had, he says, a den to which they could go. And in that den, this fox, even though it wasn't taken care of by someone else, it had a den where it would find comfort, it would find security, and it could find rest. The birds, nobody took care of the birds, and the birds had a nest, and in that nest they would find comfort and security and rest. They had their own dwelling places. But Jesus says here, he contrasts those wild animals with himself, and he says that the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. In other words, Jesus doesn't have the luxury of even what the wild animals have in this world. If you're going to follow Jesus, you have to understand how it is going to look. I mean, we all enjoy the comfort of home, the place where we can go, where people accept us, our family, and our friends. People enjoy the security of home, where you can lock your doors and be sheltered from the danger of weather and the threats outside. People enjoy rest at home, where you can just get some peace and quiet, lay down and sleep. Animals outside of the home, they have a home too. They have a cave or a stable or something like that. They're taken care of. Wild animals can even create their own. They have one, but Jesus says, I have none of that. I don't have a place, a home that I can call home. He stayed with Peter, it says, in Capernaum. He stayed with other disciples all the time. He never had his own place. He stayed with disciples at various times and places. He was ministered to by the donations of supporters and the women who offered hospitality of the group that followed him. But he didn't have his own home. He didn't have his comfort, his security and rest in one place where he could always retreat to when he needed it. I mean, how comfortable would Jesus have been? Always sleeping on lumpy couches or laying on the floor at a friend's house. But even wild animals have a place where they can create a space that fits their body and they can find comfort in their dwelling place. How secure did Jesus feel every time he went to a new neighborhood, was in a new town, new noises at night, and wondering whether they were a worry or not? The wild animals have a place where they know the sounds and they know what's normal and what is a threat. Even how much rest did Jesus get? It seemed like he didn't sleep well. He didn't get a lot of rest. He took a nap in a boat in a storm. So he was tired. And he wasn't getting rest and peace and quiet, and even though wild animals are getting that whenever they need it. So his entire life, he's saying to this man who says, I will follow you wherever you go, and he says, I live a life that is uncomfortable. I live a life that is unsettled. I live a life that is unstable in the way that everyone else enjoys it. He calls himself here the Son of Man, and it only adds to his point. It's an identity from the Old Testament that he adopts for himself. It was actually speaking of him in the Old Testament. As it suggests, the Son of Man are the children of Adam, people, human beings. And it represents in the Psalms frailty, weakness, lowliness on this earth. But then Daniel, in chapter 7 of Daniel's prophecy, it presents a vision where it says in the future that God would give one like a Son of Man. He would give him glory and dominion to rule God's eternal kingdom on earth. And so we have both of these things. The Son of Man was a person, an individual who was definitely divine as he comes on the clouds of heaven, but he was also weak and lowly. He was both, as he is presented to the Ancient of Days. So this title, the Son of Man, was Jesus' preferred way of referring to himself. He did it the most to himself. We don't even hear this being mentioned after the Gospels, besides in one place, in Stephen's martyr. And so he calls himself the Son of Man because he wants to be seen as the king, God's king, but he also doesn't want to neglect his humility, his frailty, his lowliness, and how he came. Oftentimes when people want to commit to following Jesus, they're thinking about the ascension to glory. And yet Jesus wants us to remember by his own name that there is a humiliation first and then an exaltation. If King David was our example, or Jesus' example that before him, we see that when God anointed David king, he did not just ascend to the throne and sit on it and enjoy a reign. He was on the run. He was persecuted. He had murderous threats against him. He did not enjoy living in one place. He was always moving from place to place because his enemies were always after him. Then he gets to the throne. If he wants to follow God's righteous plan, he needs to value obedience to God more than having the things of this world, the comfort, the security, and the rest. And then we see Jesus, God's king. He is anointed as God's king, and he comes and he also experiences persecution and threats. He ultimately is crucified, and he's never in his own dwelling, but he's always on the run, always moving from place to place on a mission for the Lord. And if he wants to be faithful to God, if he wants to follow wherever God is leading him, he needs to value obedience to God more than comfort in this world, and security in this world, and rest in this world. So what Jesus tells this one who says, I'm all in, I will follow you wherever you go, Jesus says, the path to follow me is the same path that I'm going to follow, which is humiliation and then exaltation. And so he's asking us if we have counted the cost. The scribe sounded like a follower. We don't really know a lot more, but he was actually a fan. He was enthusiastic about the team. He wore his jersey with pride. And yet, Jesus asks him, are you willing to get on the field? Are you in with me? And Jesus' response to the scribe is the same response that he gives to all of us, all of his would-be disciples. And even if you are a disciple already, it's a test of our commitment today. And it's this, that following him is not about comfort, not worldly comfort. It's not about security and safety in this world. It's not about rest. It's about valuing him, committing yourself to him above everything else. I mean, Jesus had less of those things than even the wild animals of this world. So if you say, I will follow you, Jesus, wherever you go, then Jesus asks you the question, are you willing to follow me if it costs you your comfortable bed, or your full fridge, or your steady paycheck, or health care, or reputation, or resume, or the acceptance of your friends, or the approval of your family? What if it costs you your savings account, or your predictable schedule, and you don't sleep in on Sundays anymore? Whatever it is, are you willing to count? Are you willing to pay the cost that it will be for you to follow Jesus? He's not demanding that you go sell your house and you give away all of your possessions. That's not what he's saying. It's simpler than that. What he's saying is, when I give a command, when I give orders, will you obey them immediately, no matter the cost? Discipleship isn't sitting in the bleachers and cheering for Jesus. It's putting down the cushion and it's picking up your cross. Following Jesus means that you're going on a road of rejection, of humility, of sacrifice, but knowing that that road leads to eternal comfort, eternal security, and eternal rest. A second person who desires to follow Jesus comes to him now in verse 21. It says, another of the disciples. This isn't one of the 12, it's just another one in the crowd who was saying, I want to follow. Another one like the scribe. And of the many who had begun to follow him, someone else comes, and they come with a different approach. Here they read, or they say, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. Again, it sounds like a reverent attitude. He calls him Lord. And he comes, he's not demanding anything, he's asking for permission. I know you're leaving. We're going across. You've given the order, but I want to know if I can do this. And he's asking if there's something he can do first. I really want to follow you, but I have something else I need to do first. How about when I'm done that, I'll catch up with you? That's in essence what he is saying. And listen to the request. It seems reasonable. He says, let me go and bury my father. Would Jesus actually deny him that request? Well, I think that we need to understand that what this request really is. What is he actually asking? Obviously, the Jews wanted to obey the 10 Commandments, one of them being, honor your father and mother. And in a culture that was built on honor, the one thing that children wanted to do was honor their parents. And as they get older, the parents get older, and to care for them, keeping the honor intact and burying them was the end of that role that they had in honoring their parents, especially the father. And so that's what this man is asking. He says, I want to obey the commandments, and I want to obey the way that the word has called me to honor my father. This is the cultural way that they did it. And so this is what he's asking. Now, to neglect this significant responsibility would bring dishonor in that society to you and to your family. So we have to put this into context. And I think if his father had already died, they buried people very quickly, within a day or a couple. So he probably would have been at the funeral or already doing that if his father had already died. It's possible that his father was sick and near death, and so what he was asking for is maybe a week, maybe a month, and then he would come and follow Jesus. But there's no indication, and it is possible that his father was fine. And the cultural weight and expectations and his desire for honor and an inheritance in that society was telling him, I want to do that first, and then I'll come follow you, which might mean that he might be delayed by years or even decades. So he shows, I love you, Lord, but I love my family, my honor, my inheritance more than you. So how does Jesus respond to this request? To someone who we would all say values something very important, their family, their parents, honor. These are all good things. And Jesus doesn't say yes or no. Verse 22 is clear, though. He says, follow me. It's simple, but it's not easy. Jesus demands that faith in him results in obedience to him. Not later, now. To loyalty, to obedience. And it's no different than what Jesus said in John 14. He says, if you love me, which this man seems to be claiming, you will obey my commandments. That's how we know whether you love Jesus or not. Obedience is the test. So we need to understand what Jesus is saying here. We all have good things in our lives that we want to value, that we want to take part in. But when good things stop us or delay us from obeying what God has commanded of us, that's disobedience. It's tough because we all have different values and they're good. But Jesus says here, what you need to do as your highest priority is to follow me. And if what you're doing is not following me, then you can't follow. You're not. One commentator said, delayed obedience is really disobedience in disguise. So Jesus declines his request and he demands a response. Will you follow me? He actually says, leave the dead to bury their own dead. And this is supposed to shock. It would have shocked everybody. Leave your dead father behind. Follow me. Me first, more than your father, your mother, your son, your daughter, anything in your life, follow me. And to prove that this was meant to unsettle us and this man and the crowd, Jesus says things like this in other places. He says in Matthew chapter 10, anyone who loves their father or mother, son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And in Luke, he says it almost harsher with the word hate. He says, if you don't commit or are loyal or are obedient to me in such a way, so deeply, so committed, that it doesn't look like you hate your family or even hate yourself, then you are not worthy. I want to be clear, Jesus isn't commanding us to leave our families, to neglect the responsibilities that we should have in this life. But it's simpler than that. It is like here, when Jesus gives an order, will you obey without delay? See, Jesus didn't say anything about leaving everything behind, but he did give an order. And now the test is on. Will you obey? And actually, if you look at verse 23, you see that his disciples got in the boat. Not everybody. Only those who got in the boat are his disciples. And so we need to be so committed. That's what he's saying to this other disciple who says, I have other things that I value as well, and more than this. And he says you need to be so committed to obeying Christ's word more than anyone else, no matter how important they may be in this world. And so this disciple sounds like a follower, just like the scribe. But he may have just been a fan. He wanted to be on the team. He had his jersey, but it was folded and put away in the drawer. He was waiting for the right time to put it on, when things would settle down in life. I'll do it later, he said. And Jesus' response to this disciple is the same to all of us, all of his disciples. And that is that following him isn't about fitting Christ into our schedules. It's about surrendering our lives, our schedules to Christ. So you can say, I will follow you. I'm in. I will follow. And Jesus will ask you, will you obey if it costs you your well-laid plans? If it costs you your plans to get that promotion at work, or the education plan that you have laid out perfectly and you are in the middle of? What if it costs you missing a family tradition or a family holiday that you have just built into your life? Or your retirement plans? Or your reputation? Or your resume? Or even opportunities that you have always wanted to give your kids? What if Jesus gives a command that pulls that back? That takes away this idea of having the perfect family or the right relationships, or it costs you your bucket list. Jesus is not demanding that you neglect your family, that you give up all of the responsibilities to certain relationships that you have. The question is simpler. When Jesus gives a command, will you obey without delay, whatever the cost? We have the Word of God. As we begin to read it and continue to read it, there are commands that come to light that maybe we haven't obeyed in the past. But when we read it and we hear what Jesus is commanding of us to do, of all of us, or even just sometimes just us, whatever the command, if He is your Lord, you will obey immediately and completely. This is what Jesus is looking for. This is what it means to be a disciple, to actually follow through and say, I will follow you wherever you go. Not someday, not when the time is right, not at the end of my life after I've done a bunch of other things. Discipleship isn't promising to participate later. It's stepping onto the field today. And following Jesus is a road of urgency. It's a road of cost. It's a road of obedience. But it leads to eternal honor and eternal joy and eternal life. So the question is clear for all of us. Are you a fan of Jesus, or are you a follower of Jesus? Not just full of enthusiasm, not just full of excuses, but full of obedience. See, fans will wear the jersey, but followers will carry their cross. And here's the good news, that when you follow Jesus, you don't just encounter His incredible authority, that you just feel compelled to obey, and you must. You also encounter His incomparable compassion, that it's His Spirit within us that sympathizes with our weakness. We don't follow perfectly. And as we do, it's through His Spirit that He supplies the grace when we stumble, the mercy when we fail, and the strength to continue when we're weak. Following Jesus does not promise worldly comfort, worldly security, worldly rest, worldly inheritance, worldly honor. It doesn't promise those things, and we should never use the gospel to try and get those things. But what it does promise is 30, 60, even 100 times more of those things in the life to come. And that's what we can look forward to. And so the question for us all is, are you a fan of Jesus, or are you a follower of Jesus?